being early in that, prompt engineering. I always tell everybody, learn to be a prompt engineer. And prompt engineering is about asking the right question. How long have you talked about that in the sales? Is to ask your client the right questions.
Right.
And that builds trust, and you can sell it easier. Same way, it's AI. Ask AI the questions the right way to get your answers. It's the perfect time to learn how to use AI.
Yeah.
Welcome to the Rethink Sales podcast. I'm Mark Dinello.
And I'm Michelle Seeger.
And Michelle, we've got a really exciting topic today, an informative topic on something that we're all interested in, which is AI and what it means for sales.
Completely relevant. I mean, we are reading so much. It's all over the news, whether you're on, well, wait, it's not called Twitter anymore, is it? What is it called?
I think it's X.
Whether you're on X or you're on reading the Wall Street Journal. I mean, it seems like AI and tools like ChatGPT are just everywhere, and it's really all over the place, isn't it?
Yep. But the question comes up for everybody, like, what does it mean for my job?
That's right. Yep.
And we don't have all the answers, but we're going to be talking to somebody today that has some really great answers. So I had the privilege a few months ago of going to a class at UNC Chapel Hill. It was an alumni class, and it was with Arvind Malhotra, and it was fantastic. So Arv is the H. Allen Andrew Distinguished Professor of Strategy and Entrepreneurship at Keenan Flagler Business School at UNC Chapel Hill. And being a Tar Heel myself, I'm really excited to have Arv. And Arv's going to talk to us about AI and what it means for work and what it means for sales. So welcome, Arv. Glad to have you here.
It's a pleasure being here, Mark and Michelle.
Yeah, we're super excited about today. Mark had sent over some of your notes and some of the information from that class that he went to, and I was wishing that I was a Tar Heel.
Doesn't everybody?
Everybody does.
So Arv, I had the opportunity. I was at a reunion, and they have these great classes at the business school where we go back, and the nice thing about the classes is they're not hard on us, so we get to actually go and enjoy class. Like I didn't really enjoy class that much, I guess, as much 30 years ago. But you did a class on AI and the future of work, which I thought was fantastic. And you shared a lot of great ideas. And one of the big ideas I wanted to start with is looking at history to understand maybe what happens in the future. And I always talk about being a student of history and how that helps with innovation. But I thought your historic perspective was really helpful just to understand major innovations throughout time and what impact they had on people and work. And maybe that's a place we can start, is just tell us a little bit about the past and a basis for understanding what might be ahead.
Yeah. There's two schools of thought. History has nothing to show us about AI. And when I was young, I'd probably say something like that it's all transformative and disruptive, words we love to use. But then there's history of great major technological shifts, especially computer technology. Of course, there's a lot more shifts in farming and automation in farming, textile industry, but closer to home, more digital quasi-technology. One of the earlier ones one can look on is the mechanical switching in telephone exchanges, which have completely been taken over. And so that's one. One can look at more recent, and it's not so recent anymore, but 90s and 80s with the advent of spreadsheets. And then one could also look at manufacturing and, CNC machining and all of computer control machining, computer control jobs and automation in manufacturing industry, what happened. So these are great historical precedences. And economists have, for us, the great news is economists have looked very deeply. So if you looked at telephone switches and phone operators, that was one place where it was a work where women were predominantly employed. And once the automated switching controls came in, there was a shift, but it also meant that women either upskilled themselves into more advanced kind of jobs or downskilled themselves into less skill requiring, but still jobs that were very important and formed a large part of the society. So that's one. Then along came, if you fast forward a tad bit, and I'll date myself, but having used it, VisiCalc, Excel,
Right.
the first spreadsheets, as we now call them, and we've not just tend to call them Excel, but Excel had precedence. More routine jobs like accountants, bookkeeping, those went away, but financial analysis, investment strategy, creators, those jobs came roaring in numbers. And then it's kind of funny in between, if you really think of, I forgot ATM, which, if you look at the earliest pictures of ATM being the first day ATM came into operation, lines outside the door waiting to use the ATM. And economists have done studies where the number of bank branches actually increased post adoption of ATMs. So that was interesting. And then, if you really looked at, again, economists studying Census Bureau numbers and going as far as back as 1950, the only true job that has been eliminated, I'm not sure if you've seen one of those recently, but that's how economists look at that and say only elevator operators is a true job that's been eliminated in any form or shape. Transformations occur. People have to move up and down the chain. So there are implications. But there are implications because we tend to, react to displacement, disruption, those kind of things. But there's also partial automation and there's augmentation. Those tend to be there as well as what we would call job displacement or complete annihilation of jobs that existed.
Mm-hmm. So people are moving up into different roles. But into maybe adjacent roles, like you talked about the ATMs, but the jobs are maybe becoming a little bit different, but it's not eliminating the need for those jobs, except, like you said, the elevator operator, which by the way, I did that as a work study job in college. I was the elevator operator. Talk about a great way to meet people. Yeah. That was a good job. But anyway, that was the one job that went away.
Yeah.
Wow.
And I wonder if,
I
haven't been to New York recently, but I even doubt, the doorman still may be pushing the buttons for the elevator, as I see in the movies. So I haven't experienced. Yeah. But there's definitely impacts. There's transformation. The nature of jobs always evolve, even if the job per se continued to exist. Its processes change and new jobs emerge. And when automation takes place, new skills are required, and if those skills require new training, then over time that occurs. But in the meantime, there's also investment in more automation, which increases, the revenue for producers because it reduces costs, and then that creates new jobs. And that happened in textile too. So there's precedents going as far back as textile and looking at innovations coming in that changed one job, but then created a job requirement for 3 or other types of jobs.
So I know that we're going to get into today, we're going to talk about how AI can be leveraged to actually make you more efficient, more productive, maybe augment a particular role. But I want to start with the big question that people are asking, which is, and it's just your opinion, in jobs that you think like that elevator operator, are there particular jobs that are out there that we think could be completely displaced or eliminated because of generative AI or AI enablement?
Yeah, and Mark had heard me say this. If it's super routine work with lots of information processing, that looks like a domain of automation, whether robotics or software AI. That looks like a domain where it's the same thing repeated over time, and also a lot of information processing occurring at the same time. And those definitely are strengths of automation and software-based. Repetitious jobs are the domain for robotics, information processing, extensive amount of information processing. Humans have cognitive boundaries. So if the information is increasing at the rate it is, and it requires a lot of processing, that again looks to be a domain of automation.
So I heard something really interesting today. I was talking to our director of marketing here at Sales Globe, and he plays a lot within AI. He was part of that beta group for ChatGPT, for example. But he was talking about how AI and ChatGPT and intelligence like that it basically, when you really put it in context, it eats, if you will, information is how he kind of described it to me. So it's already eaten and it's hungry. So it's already eaten every piece of information that was ever created on the internet. I mean, going all the way back in time, right, to the early 90s, we say. And then it needed more. So it started to eat, if you will, video, right? They started to engage in video and other things like that. And I just go, whoa, wow, right? Because I can't even imagine synthesizing that type of information. So I think that people can become a little fearful of that, but what's your take on all of that, Arv?
A healthy dose of fear is always good because it prompts you to, I wonder every day with the advent of AI, how would teaching change? So, a healthy dose of respect for technology makes you consider what is it that you do that is truly a value-added, skillful activity.
Right.
So that's the way I look at it, rather than waking up every morning and thinking AI is going to be teaching, so I might as well retire right now. I know that there are certain roles and repetitive and routine and packaged knowledge can always be taught, but knowledge also is emotive and decision making, which is still a privy of humans for now. And I think one can consider what's the emotional / decision making role or part of my process of my job, and how can I get better at that is the way I look at it, from thinking of, I know that AI can help me quite a lot, and I'm already starting to use it, and every day I'm wowed by it. But I also know that the information it's eating, as you say, is not unbiased. I mean, it comes at a cost. Right. So there's that cost of teaching people how to filter information or verify filtered information, right? So I always tell my students, because I heard Wikipedia is going to change the educational industry completely, and then that came and went. Yeah. And people said, oh, should we let them use them? Why should you not let people use any source of information, but trust and verify? To quote old, that is our job. And then ultimately decision-making is our job, our value added and emotional, So I always look at what are these components of any job that humans can get better at, because that's our core strength.
Yeah. So that leads us to, right, the something that we talk to companies about and salespeople all the time, which would be, what is it, right, that the one thing or those 2-3 things that AI will never be able to do that humans can, and how do we really think about and leverage who and what we are as we look at, our job today and the jobs tomorrow, and even the advice that you're probably giving to recent and upcoming graduates?
Yeah, as I get older, there's a time I would, and I forgot to give you my own historical context, which is I immigrated to the United States as a research assistant for AI.
Oh,
That's
interesting.
Three decades ago. So I look at AI as a race between humans and AI. When I came, humans were winning because garbage in, garbage out. So you're like, humans are not going to train you because the humans I was working with were very knowledgeable and they knew that they had the advantage. So using that context, Michelle, my pendulum's tending to get a little more centered because at that time we were winning, and I was like, it's going to do a lot of repetitious information processing jobs, and it is doing a lot of information processing. So I just wanted to use my historic context and say my pendulum may be swinging and saying, Michelle, it's a race. So we've got to win a race for our own value, right? And we also got to win a race, according to some, to beat AI or to control AI into not doing wrong things. But where do we have advantages? Where we win the race, and I think that's what you're asking me. And I think we win the race in emotional processing, right? We definitely win the race in informational processing. Right now, computers don't have enough data, intuitive data, to make this, or not intuitive data points to say, well, that would be the optimal decision for something like this. Humans are still needed for that decision-making step. And I think those are the two, but I always, human ingenuity is our advantage. And will that be replicated? I have heard convincing arguments on the other end. I think I've also heard convincing arguments that human ingenuity is always going to be there. So without the existential answer, I think there's the answer of how do we keep leveraging what we have that is so beautiful, yet we need to trust and verify. So it's been eating all this information. But we are also the information providers who've been providing lots of great information and lots of bad information. So that part's still there. You got to make the decision as to, well, does this make sense intuitively? What would be the emotional reaction of the person who's consuming our service and impact of this decision? So I think that way, Michelle, that's where we can win the race. Will it replace? I've been astounded at the ability of AI, or as most people think it's ChatGPT, but mostly generative AI, and doing things that 30 years ago I would have said, well, that's not going to be possible because that's creative work, right? So I think the creative work I'm starting to see come out of AI pretty well, generative AI. But I still think there's an emotive work, which is, I was just talking to somebody in the hospital, right? So I'd gone for a checkup and I was talking to my doctor about nursing situation. And he's like, what are you talking about AI? I can't get enough nurses. And I was reading an article about global war for talent for nursing, right? So you can also look at why, because it's super exception handling emotive work. And so I always hold that as a standard of people still want humans. They could have designed robots for bedside manners and doing all of this. But, if I am in the hospital, what do I feel if a robot moves along or a system's put in place to ask me questions in a very robotic voice? And even if I made it human, nurses are required, and the shortfall of nurses is incredible. Yeah. The other place which I was reading, and we get carried away by AI and knowledge work, and we should, because we do a lot of that work. But the shortfall of pilots in the United States, both in civil airlines as well as United States Air Force, is astounding, the shortage. So there's all of that stuff that we forget. Yeah. Coding, yes. I mean, AI is already showing. Generating logos, great. Sales Globe logo could be made better. Carolina, I love my belt, so I hope it never changes. But I think, yes, the creative part's still happening, but there's enough examples of emotive exception handling work, right? So airplanes can fly themselves, but why do we have pilot shortfall? Because they're required for that exception handling and making passengers feel safe. So there's a transition of AI do stuff that humans will accept, maybe over long term, but that transition has to be managed.
The healthcare example, I think, is a good one with the nursing and the doctors. And I was reading something the other day about the more human emotive work of the doctor being the more important thing, but then AI being able to take over a lot of the things that you see doctors doing during an appointment, like they're on their computer. Just when you're with a doctor now, they're on their computer taking notes as you're talking, and you're wondering, are they listening to me? Well, they are. So they're using recordings and AI to transcribe the recordings. And then what they call pajama time now, where the doctor goes home at night and they end up writing up all their notes, that's being done by AI. So you take a lot of those data intensive routine processes away, right? Or make those more efficient. But Yeah, I mean, are we going to ever want to get into a Star Trek situation where we've got like machines? I guess we do have machines operating on us, but
We do.
machines actually talking to us, right? To understand us, maybe not. But your point on this whole, and this has been kind of my bias for quite a while, that the ability to creatively solve problems is still innately human. That's one of the few assets that we have that can't be AI'd or outsourced. And so that's something to build upon. And Arv, you talk about this model where you get to things like more complex problem solving and higher level decision making, that's kind of the realm or the domain of humans, which I think as far as we can see right now, that's the place, right? That's the place that we can build upon.
Yeah, and I heard him mention, also discuss like human judgment, right? So trust and verify. I don't know if you guys saw an article. This is related, but the article this week in San Francisco, they've got the self-driving cars, and I don't know if you read about that, but they said they're being really rejected by the community, and they've had a couple of dogs that were hit apparently, and it's not using quite the judgment to be able to differentiate necessarily all the time. So the self-driving cars. A little tricky. So I thought that was just kind of a little visceral and very tangible example, right? When you think about the human is there, the human's not, and what can go right and what can go wrong. Yeah.
If
So
you ask somebody who loves not me, but
Yeah.
loves to drive an Alfa Romeo, would he want a self-driving car or not? So there's that value creation act.
Yeah.
Experiential activities are experiential activities.
Right. Just because you can throw a frozen dinner into the microwave doesn't mean you just still don't want to cook, right?
Well, that's true.
Yeah.
I don't use the microwave for frozen dinners, but.
And if you look at TikTok, if you look at social media and TikTok, there's more videos on how to cook and more amateur cooks than ever before. So it's
we are still human.
Democratization of being a chef, right? So that's not an accurate.
Yeah,
that's important, right? We're still human until further notice, which hopefully we never get. But
I'm beginning to feel like I'm the only person who has not been on TikTok. Anyway,
I'll be the other one, except for what my daughters send me. So if we swing this around to the world of sales, Arvind, we look at kind of the evolution of sales, and I think back on like some of those old black and white movies. I think back on It's a Wonderful Life, and people would get on a train, the traveling salesperson or salesman in those days, and they would go somewhere. So it was face to face, and then we learned that we could actually sell through over the phone. So we had inside sales, telesales for a while, phone sales, and then it became teleweb. Well, they actually can be on the phone and be on the on the chat or on the web at the same time. And then with COVID, we moved more into online, certainly, and especially with COVID, we moved into omni-channel, right? So I can go to the store, but I can also go home and I can make the purchase on the phone, or I can make it on the internet. And so there have been these evolutionary points in sales. What I'm wondering about is, what does all this mean for sales? So if we apply this thinking, we say simpler, data intensive decision making, analysis, that kind of thing. Where does that apply in sales? And what do you see happening, I guess, overall in sales in terms of maybe AI augmenting what people are doing?
Yeah, and sales is still very emotive. So I think it's a very unusual activity because I'm biased towards sales because I still I found my mother still watching QVC, and I was in them, and I was like, wow, QVC is still gold. And it's actually, I read some statistics, QVC has grown even more over the past decade. So each of these disruptive waves only makes QVC, and I don't see a robotic element selling stuff on QVC. So back to your question, all levity aside, I think it's a unique job because it has such emotive decision-making component to it, yet it has such information processing component to it, right? So it looks a perfect place for augmentation. And to me, maybe I have biased glasses. Almost all these high knowledge skill activities have both components. And I always think, wow, if we could completely leverage lead generation or lead evaluation or pricing optimization these sound to be very, these activities where there's lots of upfront informational processing, but in the end, it's always about emotive decision making, right? So that's where humans, in that process, why not let, upselling, cross-selling, I always look at those as, wow, they got me. That last element. And I'll give you an example. I went to this restaurant and I'm a poor professor, somebody else was paying for it. And they said, oh, you want to eat this pasta and it's expensive, but why don't you take the tasting menu? And then this person went on to give us 5 reasons why we should have the tasting menu. And I ended up eating the tasting menu. It was about 4 times more expensive for the person who's paying. And yet we were like, wow, we're in this profession. One was a consultant, one me being educator. And we're like, we fell for sales. So isn't that amazing that, when we let our guard down and we don't distrust this activity, it's still amazing how QVC is successful and how upsell and cross-sell. So again, going back to upsell and cross-sell, rationally, all of this would say, don't get upsold or cross-sold.
Right.
It's your consumer surplus, but yet how many times we do that, right? So that human, with a B2B, right? So people go, B2B sales is a little different. I'm like, no, humans are still human, it's still human. So let your consumers get as educated by AI or online tools or whatever they want to get educated. But that last impact of turning them into a revenue potential is a human privy to me, right? So that's such an emotive, even in the age of full informational transparency and purely true information, you still have that last step of a emotive, experiential process that requires a lot of decision making. Consumers love help in decision making, and so that's again a sales person's privy. And you both are experts. So I only read Mark's book, but and having watched so many movies on always be closing, and that always be closing also means that is where you are helping somebody make a very emotive decision and making them trust that they made the right decision.
Now you just pulled up a really interesting, I guess, mental model there. You said something like in the earlier stages of the sales process, I'm kind of, paraphrasing. So like lead generation, or maybe even backing further out to understanding who we should even be focusing on in the market, to lead generation, et cetera, that those things are more data intensive and maybe more suited for AI. Then you get further along in the sales process, closer to the close, that becomes more emotive, more human. So maybe there's some kind of rough correlation there.
Yeah, Mark, very well put. That's exactly how I would state it. That's very well put. And
I can think of one spot, Arv, where somewhere as we get closer to the human, where AI could be really helpful, which would be when you're sitting in the classic sales meeting and everybody's going through their CRM pipeline and they're like, oh yeah, this is going to close, and AI could probably tell you, well, based on all of our data, this only has a 27% chance of closing in the next 30 days, whatever it is. And, forget all the fluff and pomp and circumstance. It's not going to close, Jerry. I could see AI being very helpful there to kind of flesh out pipelines so we get cleaner, leaner pipelines as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And this resource reallocation of, I see AI being biased and I see humans being biased.
Right.
And I see this power of us crossing out each other's biases, right? AI could be super biased in processing all this information in the most rationalistic decision-making form, but humans are very emotive, non-rational decision makers, right? So that final checkpoint of, while all the data might say this is an account you should pursue or should not pursue, my intuitive appeal, which I have not been able to yet codify into data, says that that's an account maybe in long run we should continue pursuing, even if it's not profitable at this point, or that probability is low right now. But I think that probability can turn in our favor. And this is, again, your profession. But, the complementary effects are immense, right? So it frees up humans to do what we're really good at least sales, which is that decision making, intuitive thinking, creative thinking, all of those forms can then be layered on top of a rational decision model, right?
So when we think about, and we were just working with a client over the past couple of months on a question like this about lead generation. And they said, the people they get on the phones, and we watch them. They get on the phones, they make calls, they're reaching out to prospects, and their hit rate is really low. It's laborious. They don't like to do it.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, those are the first people to schedule sales interviews with us, because they would rather be doing anything than being on the phone making those cold calls. But the leaders of this sales organization, they're kind of old school. They couldn't understand why the cold calling wasn't working and why they shouldn't just be doing more of it. And we're saying, well, really what's happening now is it's more about putting knowledge into the market and creating preference and becoming an authority in your particular space, and supplementing those people calling out, if they're going to still call out, with better information. But if your point is right, which I think it is, a lot of that cold calling could go by the wayside because it's just not going to be effective anymore. Customers are going to have information sooner. And it could be something where we say, well, actually what we're going to do is we're going to use AI to come up with better thought leadership on our particular space. If we're a logistics company, as an example, okay, how do we get the best thought leadership in logistics, and what's going to resonate with our customers in the beverage industry or in whatever industry, right? And that might be a use of that replaces largely cold calling. Yeah.
And I've thought of my own profession that way too. Maybe it applies to sales, rather than a cold push, a warm pull for content or service. So cold push is like what you were talking about, versus warm pull is let the consumer demand, but then deliver the warmth along with it, the emotive part, which makes them trust that they pull the right service from you.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I think that's how I think about my own profession quite a bit.
So we got the lead gen, the data intensive stuff up there, and then we have this whole laborious thing in the middle of nurturing customers, nurturing prospects. So they responded to us, but it's dragging out. And how do we keep that going? And how do we figure out, versus having salespeople periodically call and just check in or whatever it might be, or send emails? Well, what's the best nurturing process for the types of customers or the segments and the buyers that we're talking to? What kind of information, what should we be saying, not leaving that up to chance? And maybe as we're seeing even with LinkedIn right now, maybe AI is actually taking the place of the salesperson and actually becoming the personality of that salesperson to do that nurturing that becomes very labor intensive and data intensive.
Wow, that's interesting. Yeah. What do you think about that, Arv?
I like that. I think, and that goes back to Michelle, the refrain from thinking that the emotive part cannot be done by AI, right? There's also base level emotive part, but then there's higher level emotive part. Right. There's base level creative work, and then there's a higher level creative work. And I think that's where, that's the next phase for us to take each profession and distinguish the base and higher level in each one of our professions, and then focusing on honing the higher level.
Particularly in an uncertain sales environment with arguably, at least from our client's perspective, I can say that we are in an uncertain sales environment. And what we're seeing are much longer sales cycles to just current state, like Mark was discussing, as companies are trying to figure out like what to do next. And I see a lot of fatigue across sales organizations too, because it's like, so if you could think through, right, if you could leverage AI even for what's the right information and how can they help with the nurturing of that sale, and then your effort and energy is really focused on, helping them make that final decision when they're ready to make that decision.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just hearing about a lot of burnout across different industries. So I'll bring up one example. I'm speaking at a conference that's aimed at senior living industry, which is a huge growing industry, right? When you think about baby boomers, which will be the largest segment of society that will need some type of everything from independent to full service care. Living, they are talking about how the sales cycle is really being drawn out because costs are higher right now.
Mhm.
There's still continued concerns about inflation, recession, and lingering in the background a little bit is still about what happened during the pandemic within the senior living, within segments of senior living,
Yeah.
and people not really having access to their family, their loved ones. So if we could leverage, I would think, some technology to help on the upfront qualification, let's say,
Mhm.
responding back. My understanding is people stay on wait lists for a couple of years, and that means they're not ready to go in yet, but they're waiting until they are ready to go in. So someone needs to nurture those.
Should we be getting on one of those wait lists now?
I'm not getting on them because I'm going to, no. So I
Too
read
early, Mom.
Outlive, and I'm planning on being one of those centenarians that, is going to be a high performer. I don't know, living at home. And
That is
I don't
perfect.
know. Anyway, I
Yeah,
don't know
no,
about,
I love your analogy about,
yeah,
not losing focus of long, cycles always come and go. And then
yeah,
when this cycle ends, there is going to be all of this pent-up demand. It always is. Out of pandemic, out of recessions, economies always go stronger. So, but
yes,
nurturing, as your correct word is nurturing, right? Many times we have to nurture our students too, because employment cycles also change pretty badly. But we got to
yeah,
nurture them by giving them skills, telling them if they're waiting for a job, they've been asked to wait for their jobs, what to do in the meantime, what skills to develop. So those are, I love your nurturing. So same way, maybe buyers have to be nurtured, they can't be dropped. And how do you nurture them is a big aspect of it. Why they should, giving them alerts as to, hey, maybe this is the time you start to think of that thing you have held off on purchasing for a while.
yeah. So I want to ask just a practical, tactical question for sales leaders to the individual, salesperson, frontline salesperson. How can I begin to rethink? We talk about rethinking the future of sales, how I can leverage, whether it's, part of a company initiative or not. So a lot of companies, they haven't figured out how to leverage AI,
Mhm.
right? But yet it's all out there. How could I begin to leverage it to help me do my job, to be more efficient, more effective, and have a better relationship, start to build better relationships with my clients? I'd love to hear your take on that. Both of you, I'd like to hear your take on that.
Yeah. I think one of those is just like I do, and I won't tell you my age, but how could I use all these tools? Now there are a gazillion tools, right? So which tools could I use to automate the most boring parts of my job or the least value added part? And playing with that, right? So instead of being fearful of what's coming, sometimes when you play with technology, yesterday I was trying to generate a logo and with my son, and I told him to teach me. We looked at 4 or 5 different AI tools to generate logos or graphics for my PowerPoint, and I was like, "Ooh, this is good. This is terrible." Just learning how to work with AI. This is the right period to, instead of being fearful, to learn how to work with AI to do things that would make your life, whether personal or professional, easier.
Yeah.
Right. So being early in that, prompt engineering, I always tell everybody, learn to be a prompt engineer. And prompt engineering is about asking the right question. How long have you talked about that in the sales? Is to ask your client the right questions.
Right.
And that builds trust, and you can sell it easier. Same way, it's AI. Ask AI the questions the right way to get your answers. It's the perfect time to learn how to use AI.
Yeah.
Just asking right questions. I think also in EQ, right? Your emotional quotient, right? How do you increase your emotional quotient? How do you get better at? We all have severe weaknesses, and if we think AI is coming for us, what are the things we can distinguish ourselves? There's enough research. People say, "Oh, I'm an extrovert, so I'll be a good salesperson," and I'm an introvert, I'll never be good sales. But those have been falsified, right? So especially our kids and their generations, they all have unique skills. That's one of those most promising things, and so each one of them tries to not hide their uniqueness. They try to
Mm.
highlight their uniqueness. And I
Mm.
think that's something I'm learning. I mean, when my students ask me, what can they learn? I'm like, increase your emotional quotient of how you interact with people using what you're really good at. I mean, this introvert, extrovert, type A, type B, these are very old school boxes. And the next generation doesn't have these boxes at all. They embrace their uniqueness, and then they sell their uniqueness and they leverage their uniqueness. And I think I'm learning that myself at this age as to what makes me unique in a classroom, right? What can I embrace or hone, and what can I do with AI to take away all the stuff I don't like?
Yeah. I mean, that's a great point on the uniqueness, Arv. I'm thinking back to business school and how we all thought we had to develop all these specific skill sets to be ready for the job market, which we did in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
But the reality was, I came from art school, undergrad into business school. I wasn't going to be nearly as good at some of those things as the engineers were, right? I mean, it just wasn't my strong point. But and I think we've evolved a lot over the past, I'll say 3 decades since I graduated, where recognizing our uniqueness is actually a strength, right? And so I love that idea of play that up and understand what it is, and that becomes something that's really, really important. We're not all trying to be, drones and fit a certain mold. Yeah.
And then the next generations really, my students have taught me that they embrace their uniqueness, right? They're not embarrassed by it. It's not that something, how introverts always, we felt, had to hide that they're introverts.
Right. Yeah.
I am an introvert, but I have analytical skills. You will never have decision-making power. So, I love that part, is to take a step back and, always look at what's unique about me that would be the perfect fit for this job. And if there's nothing, then I need a new job.
Yep. I want to ask you a question, Arv, based on something you said earlier about AI having bias, like humans have bias. And then an observation Michelle and I made the other day with one of our teammates that had AI write an article, and then he was testing the information in that article. And AI then said, well, a lot of this was not true. And it basically filled in a lot of blanks to create this article.
It did.
Yeah.
It said, I made this up.
Some of this I made up, but it didn't. It's like a bad kid, right? It didn't tell him until he actually forced the question. So my question for you, Arv, is how is AI becoming smarter, or how is it going to become smarter? Because now it can pass an exam for some colleges, but just barely. Some it fails, but it's got to becoming smarter. How does that happen over time?
Yeah. And we talk about, this is so fun, Mark, because when we talk about chatbots, we talk to chats as if they're humans. And then we're talking about AI being biased and humans being biased. And we forget that AI is biased because it was made by humans. And
that's right.
Right.
So inherently, it's our own bias that is replicating and amplifying itself, right? So I think the answer is in there, that verification of information to me is super important, right? Like, to get carried away on wrong information can really, really wreck a lot of good stuff. So this verification of information is going to be very super critical, right? And I think that's where one of our strengths is to use AI to verify our information, right? To fill our holes and to ask for sources or to make it look at sources. I just saw how to write prompts, which is you make it look at the things you think are trustable, rather than, you can constrict its brain, AI's brain, by telling it to look at reputable and restrictive sources for that information, and writing a prompt to do your job by looking at trusted and verified information. Right. Is a good way of removing our own biases.
It's almost like just a person. It's basically saying, well, if you look at this verified information, you're going to have a certain point of view versus, you're seeing or watching other things that maybe are on the fringe or whatever. And so your point of view is going to be based on the information that you're taking in. Yeah.
Its greatest strength is human weakness, and its greatest weakness is human weakness, and its greatest strength is human strength. So, at the end of the day, I think the way I look at AI, it's reflecting us. So hopefully societies will transform into better societies just by being reflective.
So if you look at this from we talked about salespeople. If you look at this from a sales leadership standpoint, and say I'm a chief sales officer, chief revenue officer, and I'm hearing all about AI, what should I be thinking about, unless I'm planning on retiring in a year or two? What should I be thinking about for my organization ahead, rather than kind of shying away from AI or just kind of pushing it on to somebody else? What should I be thinking about strategically about how to take my sales process, or how we work with customers, or how our coverage model works, and thinking, where might AI play in there? Not necessarily knowing the answers, but like you said, what questions should they be asking to improve their go-to-market models and their sales organization?
Yeah, I'm going to try, Mark. I think it goes back to the same framework I use all the time, is what's repeatable in my job and what requires a lot of information processing. Now, my job, or those who I manage.
Right.
And how can I leverage AI for those things? And then how do I tell who I manage, or myself, as to what distinguishes me, or what distinguishes the process by me being part of the process, right? And if it doesn't distinguish itself by me being part of the process, then it is where I have to leverage it the most. I also, this is very stupid, but it's simple and effectively stupid, is take some time to play with it. Some of these are very overhyped tools. The reality of the tools is very different from the hype of the tools. So, sometimes you just have to look at the tool, because if somebody tells you that, hey, I'm going to be able to use this tool to do this and this and this, having that ability to say, no, I don't really think so. But if it's price optimization, I'd look at a tool. I mean, just to be more concrete in your world, just to, what can help me make decisions better for my clients, and play with those tools. I mean, it's always such a great idea. Any tool for that matter, even to create a new logo, because it shows you how AI is thinking in different fields.
Right. Take your logo example. I'll just take my whole art school background. When I look at AI creating logos, what scares me about that is it's kind of like back in the days, I'll date myself, back in the 80s, when we've had our first Mac pluses, the little boxes that sat on the desk, the little black and white screen. Everybody's like, well, desktop automation, everybody's going to be able to do newsletters, and everybody's going to be able to do their own advertisements and all this stuff now. So the need for design firms is going to go away, right? And it's sort of like that, saying, well, AI can develop logos. But what we found with all of that is, just because you give somebody, a hammer, or give somebody a loaded gun in terms of desktop automation, doesn't mean they know what to do with it, right? So what happened was a whole generation of the most horrendous design that you'd ever seen, because people now had the ability to do their own design work, right? It was horrific, right? And so I see AI generated logos now, and I'm like, okay, what's the concept behind that logo? Yeah, I can mix and match and throw stuff into a blender and come up with different images, but what problem is it trying to solve in terms of what we're communicating, the corporate voice, whatever those things might be? So I think that's just an observation on logos itself, but it also talks to your point about the emotional intelligence and the humanity of understanding what's really going to communicate, or what's going to really get across to people. So I think to play on top of your answer too, Arv, what I would do if I were a sales leader as well, I would take your criteria and I'd probably break apart the different components of our go-to-market strategy. So I'd probably take the sales process all the way from segmentation and targeting and what customers are looking at, to lead generation, to nurturing, to closing the sale, to implementation, whatever it might be. And I would ask those questions about what's data intensive, what could AI actually supplement in an unbiased way, where do we still need to have the human element? And I'd probably look at that across the coverage model as well, in terms of the roles that we're using, because some of those roles, it might be, and companies are already doing this, right? Maybe certain customer care roles, to face-to-face roles, to certainly online internet purchasing, internet information acquisition. A lot of that can be automated. Some of it can't. But I'd start to break apart kind of those different components and ask those questions. Go through your questions and ask those, and then I certainly wouldn't know the answers, but I would know the answers I was trying to find, right?
Yeah.
And then put the right people on that. But I think your point about playing with the tools is a big one, because I think just the fear of it and shunning away from it is worse than actually understanding what it really is at this point in its development.
Yeah, it is. It is. Because the tools also help you map what you said, right? So if you find the reality is not where you think it is, then you suddenly find we as humans are really good at this. And so you start to separate that in the map, which says, it still is part of emotional intelligence, and it's not. And over time, things will shift to,
Right.
as I said, to Michelle's response to Michelle, whether they'll take over or not. We perhaps won't be here, but not to answer existential questions, but to say, well, there's a way to analyze what's the privy of humans and our strengths and what's good with AI, and how do you figure it out unless you play with it? Because again, going back to your logo thing, I played with the logo, 6 different. All I wanted them to do was to make a graphic image which shows business disruption, and I couldn't get it to do it right. So I got my son to come help me. He's like, why don't you put fire? I'm like, no, son, you can't put fire for disruption. What about explosion? I was like, no, that's not disruption. And so at the end of the day, I gave up. I was like, I'll just put the word disruption, and it'll resonate better with people than trying to find a graphic for a PowerPoint slide.
Right. Because what you brought up there was a complex kind of emotional problem. And when you say business disruption, well, yeah, you have kind of the immediate things of what things are disruption or destructive, but then you have metaphors. Like, what is destruction? What is disruption? And what are metaphors for that are positive metaphors? And so, yeah, I suppose AI could do that at some point, but those are very human questions.
Yeah. When I think about how salespeople can start to play in the space, a couple things come to mind, right? Well, when I think about, oh gosh, I'm going out there looking at new customers, right? I'm out there looking at what the opportunities are, and I've got this lead list. But having it help you do that research and gathering the information for you across, because if you think about what that AI ate, right? We talked about everything that it ate, anything from, who knows, a CEO's YouTube video channel that you may not know exists to their LinkedIn profiles and any other articles that are out there about the company, recent M&A, whatever that might look like. Yeah. But to be able to synthesize that and help you understand the story of the company can help you understand what your buyer may be solving for. Again, so you're not asking AI to solve the problem, but what you're doing is leveraging it to gather you information, save you some time. I can see that being really helpful.
Yeah. And what you're talking about within that, you said the story.
Yeah.
The story is something that's human too. It's like, within all this information, how do I find the story of, if we're going to meet with the CEO, the story of the CEO, not just in terms of her resume or his resume, but what have been the challenges, the drivers, the things that are going to be meaningful as that person looks ahead. Right. So we can do a better job helping them. So that's a human thing.
Yeah, you nailed it. I mean, I asked somebody.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, Michelle. Go for it, Michelle. Sorry.
I was just going to say, I think what I'm hearing is that sales or people aren't dead. We're not out of the equation yet. Anyway, we're not out of the fight.
Not dead yet.
Well, you know what I mean. I think that's sales. I was recently talking to a sales leader of a global manufacturing technology firm, and they were one of the first companies that made a decision to get out and see their clients as the pandemic, as some of those restrictions were lifting. And they came back and said, boy, what we're hearing is the person who shows up, the one that looks them in the eye, that they're building the trust with and can tell them, why their product and service is going to help them solve their problem, are the ones that are winning the deals.
Yeah.
So I still think the human element is very important.
And the showing up piece, yes, it's important to build the human connection, I'm also thinking, Michelle, based on what you're saying about this idea of understanding what's going on within the customer. If we're talking about kind of a two-dimensional flat world, and we're doing this, right? We're on Zoom calls and we're connecting on email and that type of thing. That's one way of gathering data that I assume AI could handle. But if you picture, Arv, as an example, you go in and you're a consultant and you're walking into the client's office and you're observing what's going on in the hallways and you're seeing how people are working and you're going on a customer call and you're watching how the customer interacts with the salesperson. Unless you have like some kind of AI on your shoulder, I don't know how it gathers that kind of information, that kind of knowledge, at least in this generation that we're talking about. That would be very hard to do in a three-dimensional world.
Yeah. And that's, isn't that what everybody's realizing? Because I had students who took me virtually and then they took me in class and they said, "You're so much better in class." It's like, I don't find myself really different. And I think that was the part of being part of their emotional decision-making about, I am part of their emotional requirement from education. I am not critical part, that I realized, but I am part of their emotional journey. And so is, and this is interesting. I didn't want to let this go because I asked somebody, he's my mentor, and he says things that are so brilliantly simple. I said, "What's our job?" He said, selling knowledge through storytelling. So I was like, wow, storytelling and selling, that's everybody's job.
Mm-hmm. That's
so
right.
I was like, he's such a good storyteller. I'll always be terrible. But then I was like, maybe I'm a stand-up, so I'll tell jokes.
I think you're a great storyteller. And I think that's one of the reasons we're talking today, because I sat in your class, Arv, and I'm like, man, this is great. This is a fantastic story. Plus you're funny. So that's even better. Right?
Thanks, Mike. You could tell that to my kids who don't think it's very funny.
So Arv, as we're finishing up here, what one piece of advice would you give to a sales leader on AI and what they should be thinking about?
Verify. One word: use and verify, and get comfortable. I think get comfortable. Change is very uncomfortable. Winners or losers are governed by who gets comfortable with change.
Right. Excellent. Well, thank you. This has been a great conversation. How can people get in touch with you, Arv? You're at Keenan Flagler Business School at UNC Chapel Hill. Is there a way they can connect with what you're doing or ask you questions?
Absolutely. I think being an educator at a public university, I'm the most accessible person. You just have to type my name in the Google bar. You'll get my phone, my email, and also access to my research articles and research thoughts. So it's all there in the Google bar.
Okay.
That's great.
Arvind Malhotra, thanks for joining us. And we really appreciate you being on the Rethink Sales podcast, and look forward to talking to you some more.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mark and Michelle.
Thank you.
Thank you.